It's Dr. Gill. He is a professor in University of South Florida. He got all his 3 degrees from Harvard University, and he is an expert in the case study and also in many fields. So let's welcome him to start the presentation. Thank you.
Hi. Well, it's wonderful to be here, and I am going to jump right into this presentation, whose title is going by so swiftly I don't remember, but it doesn't matter. I'm going to begin talking about what we mean by complexity. I begin almost every presentation with this because complexity is essential to the way I view the world. I'm then going to talk a little bit about the notion of an informing system, and particularly the role that information technology plays in the overall complexity of what we'll do. With that, I'll introduce the cybernetic complexity cycle, which is how the introduction of technologies into tasks over time changes the real-world environment in a kind of cyclical fashion and presents a certain number of challenges. And finally, I'll talk about some of the things we need to think about if we wish to address these challenges. So let's start by talking about what complexity is. Complexity is very hard to get a consensus on. When I studied the literature, I found 13 different definitions of it. But part of the reason is that complexity manifests itself in 3 separate domains, and you really need to keep them clear in your mind when you talk about complexity. On the one hand, there's the domain about what goes on inside our head. It's non-symbolic, and it basically is particularly focused on feelings that we get. At the other extreme, there's complexity as it manifests itself in the real world. As systems move, the real-world consequences for what we do, these do not necessarily depend upon us as an individual. They are more closely related to the tasks that we perform. Finally, there is the complexity as it is represented, and this representation involves turning the task into some sort of symbolic form that we can use to communicate with others, that we can use to incorporate into artifacts such as information technologies, that we can use to store and recall. For example, writing notes to ourselves moves an element of our task into a symbolic form that we can use to later bring it into our heads. So this is our problem space. So let me just quickly go over some of the characteristics of these different domains. So if we think about the domain of experienced, when we encounter complexity in the experience level, we experienced emotions or feelings such as difficulty. When we find something's difficult, we often refer to as complex. Uncertain. When we have a feeling of uncertainty, when a task seems uncertain, we treat that as being complex. Ambiguity. Face or saxophone. Ambiguity seems complex because the rules seem different depending upon how we interpret something. Now, all of these are feelings. Now, the important thing about complexity of this sort is as we gain experience performing a task, generally its perceived complexity goes down. So the more routine a task, the less we experience complexity, the less complex we view it to be. I'm teaching my son Jonathan to drive right now. What seems complex to him now in 4 or 5 years is going to seem so routine he won't even have to think about it. Okay, now we move to the symbolic domain. And here we're dealing with, in a sense, how many symbols does it take to represent the task? And if you look, for example, at the Manhattan Street map versus the Boston Street map, one of the things you will see is that people intuitively tend to sense that the Boston Street map is more complicated than the Manhattan Street map, even though they have about the same number of streets and maybe the same number of people and so forth. Why? Because Manhattan is laid out in a regular grid. In fact, in this particular area of Manhattan, essentially two coordinates, the number of streets southeast and the number of streets southwest, will take you between any 2 points. So it is relatively easy to express directions. On the other hand, when you get to Boston, there is no such simple way of expressing directions from point A to point B. It requires a larger expression. Now, this is not the only way of dealing with problem space complexity. There are lots of other measures that have been proposed, such as the number of branches, McCabe's cyclomatic complexity, the actual theoretical minimum size of the problem space, something along the lines of Kolmogorov complexity and so forth. But at any rate, complexity grows as we add information. Finally, we have ruggedness. Now, ruggedness involves basically a mapping of different strategies for performing a task given a particular context. And if you sort of visualize these across all possible strategies, at one extreme you've got a decomposable landscape where there is one strategy that is clearly better, and we can kind of incrementally move towards that strategy by changing individual attributes. Another, highly rugged, where there are lots of different local peaks, and the local peaks have sharp drop-offs. Here it's much, much harder to come across a particular strategy. The other characteristics are just in terms of decomposable versus rugged, an SAT. Getting the right answer to a particular question always makes your score better. A cookbook's a more rugged example. There are many, many different nice high fitness combinations, but you can't ask a question, does a particular attribute that contributes to fitness, say garlic, is it a good or a bad attribute? Well, garlic is a good attribute in some contexts, like lamb, a bad attribute in other contexts, like angel food cake. So as a consequence, here it is the combinations that matter much more than the individual attributes, so it's very context dependent. Go ahead. Another characteristic of real-world complexity is turbulence. And turbulence is different from mere volatility because it tends to have periods of relative order followed by unpredictable sharp changes, sometimes referred to as punctuated equilibrium. And complex systems tend to exhibit this kind of turbulence, punctuated equilibrium, and so forth. So, if we take a look at turbulence and ruggedness, I have to go over this very quickly, but they all tend to be affected by a number of things. The number of attributes or elements in the system, the degree of interdependence or interaction between them, the rate at which they can change each other's values, and ultimately, as you tend to increase these things within a system, it tends to increase the level of real-world complexity we experience. Okay, so if we take a look at the relationship between these various domains, what you realize is the domains can't really be separated. You cannot look at a problem without dealing with all three domains. And an analogy I picked out from Jonathan Haidt's The Happiness Hypothesis is that of the rider and the elephant. And to that I've added the terrain. Think of the rider as the rational, symbolic view of complexity, the rule-based strategy. The elephant is the emotional experience, not necessarily symbolic aspect of complexity, and the terrain is this real-world complexity of ruggedness and turbulence. So if you think about this, you can't really talk about, a trajectory between 2 points without knowing what's going on in the minds of the rider, what's going on in the mind of the elephant, and what's happening in the terrain. And if you use this analogy, there are a lot of parallels. For example, the rider is in control until the elephant thinks otherwise. Our emotions, our experience complexity will take over in our problem solving when it gets too difficult, even if we had rules otherwise. Riders tire out a lot faster than elephants, which means that over the long pull, your experiences are more likely to drive your behavior than your rationality. When the terrain gets too scary, elephants stampede. If the real world starts doing strange things, our emotion, our animal experience can force us to engage in all sorts of behaviors. Elephants like to be in herds. I don't go into the derivation here, but it turns out imitation is a great strategy when you don't know what the heck you're doing in a very complex environment. When traveling in a group, riders think they're following other riders. Elephants think they're following other elephants. And, you don't know who you're following. Elephants alter the terrain. As you wander through a terrain, as you enter this landscape, you change it. Okay, so let's move on quickly to informing systems and the role they play. An informing system is just a network of individuals and or artifacts, such as information technology, that has been designed or has evolved to support the performance of a task. Now, what happens when we add information technology to informing system? We reduce the cost of symbolic processing, which means it becomes cheaper to move things into the problem space than to leave them in the experience zone. So we end up having to rely less on intuition and practice and more on rules and procedures, communications, and models, because IT makes these cheaper. Example here, Turbotax. Every year I perform my taxes. Well, to say I perform them is incorrect. The last time I actually performed them solo was in 1985. In 1986, I added a program called Turbotax to my problem space. Now, by doing this, I added a whole bunch of new rules and stuff that I don't even know, but since they're accessible to me, it doesn't matter. They're part of my problem space. Using Turbotax, I have been able to handle increasingly large returns, not monetary-wise, just paperwork-wise, that have really become more and more complicated over time. But Turbotax makes this possible because it guides me through them step by step, asking for data, telling me exactly what I need to get. Essentially, you could train many primates, certainly not gibbons, but many primates to use Turbotax if they're just willing to follow the instructions. Now, do I understand what's going on when I use Turbotax? No, I don't have any deep understanding, but I get the job done. Information technology has allowed me to do something which I simply otherwise would not have been able to do. So, if we look at the benefits, we see our information technology helps us better observe and control our environment. It guides us through complicated procedures. It provides us with access to expertise. In Turbotax, I can even chat with an expert if I want. It facilitates communications with others. I can chat with an expert. I can also access tax forms. Thereby, this reduces the complexity I experience. But the cost of that is I've added to the complicatedness. So I've moved complexity from one form to another. Now, what is the effect of offloading the complicated to information technology, which we do more and more? Well, for one thing, it tends to move our problem solving from reasoning towards search. We see this with our students all the time. When we start building processes, we worry less about adapting the process to the specific things, to creating, efficient systems to do the process for us. We become increasingly used to using quantitative data. Quantitative data has a big advantage over qualitative data in that we can search for it. When people apply to colleges today, they are applying to an average of 10 colleges. Why is that? It used to be much fewer. Well, one, there's a common application supported by information technology, which makes it much easier to apply. And two, there are lots of websites which allow people to get all the information on colleges so that they don't have to visit them. So what we're doing is we're turning from the qualitative in-depth visit to the quantitative, okay, let's see where this thing sits on the US News and World Report and what we can get into approach to applying to colleges. When approached with a problem, we're less concerned with understanding the problem than operating a system that will solve it for us. Hence Turbotax. Knowledge building. Transformative knowledge building. When a problem's too hard in the old days, we had to find a new way to look at the problem to try to solve it. Now, technology allows us to avoid that much longer because we can add incremental pieces to our technology to help us do that. Now, I'm not saying these are necessarily bad, but what I'm saying is that IT is changing the skills that we practice, and that is impacting the way we think, because remember, what we practice changes what we perceive to be difficult. If we don't practice something, it will remain difficult for us. So those skills on the left. Now this leads to a sort of an interesting cycle. Moving on. Suppose we start increasing information technology use. One of the most common things that happens here is we increase the number of people or entities or whatever we connect to, the number of participants, we speed up our reaction time. All of these things are the same type of factors that tend to, in a system, produce increased turbulence and increased ruggedness. Well, I know I'm going a little bit behind, but okay, just page up and page down are easier with these things. Okay, there you go. So what we see is turbulence and ruggedness grows. Now, as turbulence and ruggedness grows, complexity as we experience grow. Remember, this is real world complexity. We are going to experience this. The market's going to get more scary. We're going to have more choices, more uncertainty, more ambiguity. So we seek to reduce that. We need better models. We need better way of observing other people. Well, how do we do that? We ask for more information technology because these can help us with these things. And what happens then? We use more IT. External complexity grows, and so forth. We grow into a growing cycle of ever-increasing external complexity. Now, what does that do for us? Keep going. It increases ruggedness, the expectation of these dynamic shifts. Next. It increases the number of fitness peaks and the sharpness of the drop-off between fitness peaks. So that basically that means that we can feel a much, much greater risk associated with going out and experimenting. Once we're on a peak, we want to hold to it. Go on. So, information technology to the rescue. Here are a bunch of technologies that help us imitate others. We can see how many people viewed a video to determine if we're going to like it. We can see how people rated it to determine if we're going to like it. We can establish social networks and others with groups who are like us as a way of advertising ourselves so others can imitate us and allowing ourselves to imitate others in different ways. Next. We tend to see more entrenched silos and tribes. As the word gets more difficult, you tend to find yourself focused into smaller groups of common interest because it's a safer feeling. Homophily, this tendency to cluster with others, reduces the ambiguity of the world because you have a lot of people with the same worldview. Go ahead. We're going to see more power law fitness distributions. An empirical characteristic of real-world complexity is it spews out power laws. And power laws always lead to unequal distributions. Go ahead. It will also tend to shrink our time horizons because when you have low real-world complexity, you can look out in the world and the band of uncertainty, grows relatively slowly. That makes you feel in control, and it helps you identify with your future self. As real-world complexity grows, remember, because of those jolts and shifts in real-world complexity, the band of uncertainty grows, and it becomes much harder to identify with your future self. Remember all those rockers in the 60s who were saying that they hoped they would die before they were 30 and are now performing rock and roll to sell out crowds in their 70s. Go ahead. We also find that things start to get really complicated when we try to compensate for these factors. So we got the Dodd-Frank bill, 2,319 pages, telling Congress what regulations it needs to create. Or not Congress, the SEC and others, the Fed. The Obamacare, up to 30,000 pages so far and growing. And guess what? It's going to have to grow a lot bigger if it's going to work because they're already having to delay passages. This is just the sales matrix for SAP. Can you imagine how complicated the product is if this is the matrix that tells you which version of the product to buy? I mean, we've got TurboTax and so forth, so keep going. All right. So what am I saying? As real world increases, complexity increases, general principles tend to move towards specific interests. Exploration becomes too risky, so we move towards imitation. Time horizons move from the long to the short. Equality of opportunity increasingly becomes less of a concern than equality of outcome because of all of these power laws that we're seeing. And for those who are already successful, they're less worried about expansion and more worried about preserving what they have. So things are getting ugly. So how do we address these challenges? Well, the first thing to remember is that these things are not all bad, because turbulence means that even if you reach the top, you're not going to stay there forever. If you take a look at the Fortune 500, for example, between 1999 and 2009, a 10-year period, about half of them turned over. So it's not like success is permanent. The very turbulence that is painful for us also creates opportunities. Ruggedness means that there are plenty of new fitness states yet to be investigated. So without this real-world complexity, there would be no opportunity. But as educators, what we need to try to do is we need to prepare our students for this, while at the same time, trying to minimize the really negative impacts of real-world complexity. Today we emphasize courses that cover all content without worrying whether our students understand a whit of it. We broadcast knowledge without worrying whether the students perceive it being relevant. We evaluate outcomes, whether it be knowledge or problem-solving outcomes. Do they get the right answer? and we focus on what we perceive as timeless knowledge, which might be true in elementary mathematics, but in almost every other field is becoming increasingly of concern. What we should be emphasizing is opportunities to practice core skills, because if we want people to have problem-solving skills, if we want people to have those skills that IT is taking away from us, we have to have them practice it enough in the educational system so that they become instilled in our students. We need interactive learning with faculty and peers, because ultimately it's really hard to teach someone something they don't want to learn. And so there needs to be a give and take there to make sure that we can move the appropriate knowledge back and forth. We should be evaluating reasoning skills and problem-solving processes as opposed to outcome, because the processes are likely to be useful for a very long time. The outcomes are likely to be transitory in a highly complex world, and focus on dealing with the unexpected. Part of the reason that bubbles and all these other phenomena occur at such large magnitudes is because people get scared. But the fact is, in real-world complexity, the fact that this stuff is happening does not mean something pathological is going on. It's a sad consequence of the system, and so as a result, we have to learn to get over it and not overreact. And in doing so, we'll make the system a little bit more stable. We need to place a much greater emphasis on achieving adaptability. Efficiency is great for achieving goals with minimum amount of resources. My students are always interested in efficient ways of doing assignments, i.e. ones that require as little effort as possible. Maximizing productivity. And efficiency is great for complicated, stable situations, because in a complicated, stable situation, you have the time to determine what an efficient path is, and it's going to remain that way for a while, and it's worth doing it. In a highly real-world complex environment, however, we need to be adaptable. We need to learn how to change goals without disruption, accept the fact that sometimes you have to get off your hill and move to another hill, even if it requires going through some lower comfort states in between. Adaptability is great for the survival in the event of the unexpected, which is really important because the unexpected will happen in today's environment, and it's really what we need for real-world complexity. And we are going to see increasing real-world complexity as far as I can say. For information technology, let's try to avoid making systems that are more complicated. I would say information technology has already gone a considerable ways towards understanding this. They're understanding a set of small, loosely coupled operations is a lot more complicated. Is a lot less complicated than a large single application. Small is becoming competitive with large. There may be a day when the printers, the 3D printers that are today used for prototyping, start to make economical factories at a very small scale. This has happened before, in other industries, and we're seeing today in the software business new tools for creating software rapidly are causing some of our developers to move back onshore to the US. We need to employ open architectures. Bring complication into the open so it can be addressed. Occasionally, you can reduce a complicated problem through great insights. That's what we call genius. But it helps if you know what the source of the complication is. And we want to give people, the users, power to help participate in this process. Remember, complication is an externality. It's a form of pollution, because the more complicated a system is, the greater the pain you will have when something disrupts it. Go ahead. Build a portfolio of skills, projects, and people. Diversity is one of the Adaptability is one way of dealing with real-world complexity. Diversity is the other good way. because diversity ensures that you've got lots of locations on the landscape. These are laws from biology. There are different types of diversity that we can have when we're building our systems. Diversity in development skills. Create a portfolio of these. Diversity of projects. And a diversity of people for different perspectives. Go ahead. Ultimately, what we should be seeking is something that is referred to as anti-fragility. This is from Nassim Taleb's 2012 book, Anti-Fragile. In artificial systems, once you reach a certain level of stress, they tend to break. Most natural systems, such as the human body, actually respond to considerable stress by getting better over time. And what we need to do is think about how to incorporate those ideas into our technology designs and into our educational designs so that as we experience the stresses that real-world complexity provides, we can get stronger. Okay? Well, I don't think I've left any time for questions, but I did make the 30 minutes.